and development. We will be recording the session today, and that will be posted online on our webpage following in the next few days. So we're going to hand over very shortly to our main speaker today, and the presentation is from Philipp Öhlmann of Humboldt University on African-initiated Christianity and sustainable development, following his recent book published by the Routledge Religion in Research in Religion and Development series. Edited by various colleagues as well, and I'm sure he'll tell us more. So what we're going to do is we're going to have maybe about 20 minutes of presentation from Philipp, and then we're going to have a response from Ignatius Swart, who's from the University of Western Cape in South Africa, which will be 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for discussion after that. Okay, so Philipp, I'll pass over to you if you are ready to share your screen, and let me know if you need any help with that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olivia. Before I start sharing my screen, I just want to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present today. And I think this is just a fantastic format. I really think it's an excellent idea. And I mean, it becomes even more relevant now in Corona times, but it was already an excellent idea before Corona. So let me start sharing my screen. Let's hope host disabled participant screen sharing. Maybe you can switch this option on, Olivia.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, now it should be working. Yeah.
Okay.
And same thing happens to me all the time as well. Okay, let's see if we can make this full screen now. Now you should have the presentation full screen, is that right?
Yes, that's worked.
Excellent, wonderful. Well, thank you very much once again. And I'm so happy that one of my co-authors is here as well, Marie-Luise. And Marie-Luise, let me just mention, if you want to come in at any time, do feel free to jump in and to interrupt me and add on or correct what I'm saying yeah, at any time. My presentation is on African-initiated Christianity and sustainable development. And I just want to start by first of all, pointing out that this is joint work with Marie-Luise and Wilhelm, both at Humboldt University. We are the core team of the research program on religious communities and sustainable development at Humboldt University. And I'll mainly talk about our book, or the introduction to our book, African-initiated Christianity and the Decolonization of Development, Sustainable Development in Pentecostal and Independent Churches. You should see a picture of the book there. The nice thing about it is it's available in open access. So we are very fortunate to have this, to not only have this thing in this excellent Routledge series, but also to have it as an open access publication. Especially because we have several colleagues contributing to the book from institutions in the global south, and where libraries are sometimes not able to purchase the high-priced books or e-books from the global north publishers. So we are very fortunate on that. And this book is very much connected to a research project we implemented over the past 3 years, from 2017 to 2019, which is called Potentials of Cooperation with African-Initiated Churches for Sustainable Development. I'll also talk about this project. I mean, it's very much intertwined, the book and the research project. To just say 2 words on this research project, it is a project that was funded by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, so the German Development Department, within an initiative of trying to broaden existing partnerships in development cooperation. There's been an initiative on religion and development in German development cooperation since 2014, and they commissioned several research projects, and one of these projects was this one on African-initiated African-initiated churches and sustainable development. And the book emerged in the context of this research project and very much feeds into this, both feeds into the research project and emerges from the research project. To give you a brief overview, what I want to talk about is, first of all, to give some sort of perspective on African-initiated Christianity. What do we mean by that? Why is it relevant to talk about African-initiated Christianity? And then to highlight 6 potentials of African-initiated Christianity for sustainable development, 6 potentials that we identified in the course of our research, and that we also mentioned in the introduction to our volume. And those 6 potentials, or those 6 realms, are very much influenced by the or emerging from the contributions in the volume and also our own field research. Now, speaking of field research, this is just a brief map to show you where this material, or the empirical material, the interview material that I'll be quoting, or some of which I'll be quoting, is coming from. We conducted research in West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, or South Africa to be precise, over the past 3 years, and that's all mainly in 2017, 2018, and that's where most of these quotes are coming from either of these interviews. The figures are interviews and focus group discussions. So it's the number of interviews / the number of focus group discussions we conducted in these countries. That just as a background on the research project and this research initiative, also the book emerged from. Now, to talk about what do we mean by African-initiated Christianity? Well, the easy answer is to just put up a definition. Churches founded in Africa by Africans and primarily for Africans. It's a 1967 definition by Turner, without missionary godfathers, as John Povey and Gabriel Oshitelo added in 1998. Now, basically, there are 3 movements or 3 realms of churches that we summarize under this category of African-initiated Christianity. The first one is, or the first wave that we talk about, is so-called independent or nationalist churches. The terminology differs a little bit from context to context. So basically secessions, early secessions from mission churches, very much an church-based independence movement in the churches, and there are also there's also quite some cross-fertilization to the political independence movements from that time onwards. Those churches emerged mainly from the end of the 19th century and then early 20th century. From the 1900s, from the early 20th century, you also have a second wave, spiritual churches that not only seceded from mission churches, but that also had a very contextual emphasis in their worship and their theology, and that have a close relation to African traditional belief systems. So it's very much an indigenization. So from the independence movement to an indigenization, and then the post-independence religious movement, or post-independence African-initiated church movement, the African Pentecostal churches or Pentecostal charismatic churches, which have a global relation. I mean, this is very much related to this global Pentecostal movement and upsurge in the global Pentecostal sphere, with all the characteristics, or many of the characteristics that we know from other contexts as well, prosperity gospel, and so forth. I won't go over the different terminologies. I mean, you'll find that in the book, and yeah, you also have it on the slide. So there are different terms for these categories of churches in the different contexts. Now, what we would say really are three common characteristics of this of these churches, or of African initiated Christianity. The three that you'll see now: independence, contextuality, and spiritual worldview. So while, I mean, this is a very heterogeneous movement, and of course it is necessary to further differentiate according to these waves and, you know, to country context and so forth. Yes, definitely. But still, there are common characteristics that one can identify. Independence, a history of institutional and financial independence from mission churches, from the historic European and North American Christian confessions. Second, contextuality, a contextual expression of religious movements, a common origin and rootedness in colonial and post-colonial Africa. And third, the significance of the spiritual in their cosmology. This is what we call spiritual worldview, be it the Holy Spirit, spiritual forces, or healing, even though acknowledging that there are very different, that some of these waves, or even some of these churches in that movement, have different positioning towards African traditional religion, African traditional belief systems. Now coming to the second part, potentials, identifying six potentials of African initiated Christianity for sustainable development. Those are the six key points where we would say those are potentials of these churches with respect to development, and more specifically sustainable development. Demographic significance, and I'll talk about each of those later. I'll just mention them now. Development activities, African solutions, empowerment and agency, transformation, and then the most important one, decolonizing development, which also influenced the title of the volume. First, on demographic significance, this is, I mean, it's very difficult to get figures on religious affiliation in many African countries, especially below the level of just having Christian or Muslim. So having data on different confessions is really something one can struggle with, and it's even more difficult to have comparable data. So all these figures are just to be seen with very much a question mark, and are to be carefully digested. But the one thing that I think is just illustrative here, you see the gray bars are religious movements that we would consider being part of African initiated Christianity. And I mean, those six countries, basically the six of those countries that we also conducted field research in. The main point I want to make here is that about a third of the Christian population in these countries can be allocated to African initiated Christianity. So this is a huge religious movement with large networks in remote areas and so forth. So all these institutional or structural arguments that are always made with respect to religious communities, they have these large networks, and they are even in the remotest corners. I mean, this is very much true of this religious movement. Second, development activities. What is also quite interesting, and this comes out in many of the contributions also in the volume, and this also emerged from our own field research, is that these churches, or many of these churches, most of these churches, I would even say, are already development actors. So whereas they are not recognized on the international development scene as much as FBOs are, and as much as mainline or mission churches are, it really clearly emerges that that they are active in development related activities in manifold ways. And here's just a response to the question, to an interview question that we posed: how does your church support the community? And without going through all these things, it just becomes clear that there are really large areas of activities, and even the smallest neighborhood church is engaged in some sort of development-related social service activities. And one can relate that to the major problems identified by those churches. Also another interview question, whether the major problems in people's lives, poverty, lack of food as the major, as the most often mentioned item, lack of education, unemployment, health-related problems, and then spiritual problems. And if one puts those graphs next to each other, sorry, I'm a little bit fast on this one. You can, I mean, I'll be happy to share the presentation with you if you want to look at the smaller items as well. If you put those graphs next to each other, you see that they correspond. You have the major activities in those areas where the greatest needs are identified. So, I mean, the point I guess I want to make is that these churches directly respond to what they perceive as the community's needs. I mean, they respond with their development activities to what they perceive as the community's needs, and that includes, of course, spiritual elements. Now, the third point, African solutions. There we make the point that they are actors that are embedded in the local context and grassroots movements, and they hence, in terms of development and social service activities, constitute durable, autochthonous social and institutional structures. And this relates to, there's a quote I put up here from the African Union Agenda 2063. This is exactly what puts them in a position to achieve this development that is people-driven, relying on the potential on the African people. I mean, this is the quote, this is what the African Union Agenda 2063 says, one of the important policy documents. There's a quote there from a leader of an African-initiated church, who's also the president of the Organization of African Instituted Churches, the umbrella organization, arguing why religion relates to or should be included in development, and why religious communities should be at the forefront. People from sub-Saharan Africa are highly religious, and anything that touches the religion of the people they take very seriously. Because of our colonial history, there's a way that people look at secular things. They look at it as governments, and government is still seen as something that is very far away. But if it is religion, people take it to heart. That is how you can get something positive in transparency and accountability and all that, because of the spiritual aspect. So really a contextual approach that is emphasized here. A fourth point that we make is empowerment and agency, and this relates to, on the one hand, to the economic sphere. There's a strong emphasis on economic empowerment, and I mean this relates, of course, back to the major problems identified. There's a strong emphasis in these churches, and this emerges from the existing literature as well as the interviews that we conducted. Olivia, in case you're trying to send me messages in the chat, I'm not monitoring the chat, just in case I'm not seeing any time. Every once in a while there's something popping up. No,
you're good. It's people just introducing themselves. Yes, so you're good.
Okay. So if I'm overstretching my time, you need to just tell me and not just send a chat message, just in case. Okay. Yeah, so this relates to the economic realm, and that is really something very much emphasized by all these churches, and somewhat surprisingly by all the three waves, all churches from the three waves. I mean, you have churches from the first and second wave that we interviewed very much the same way, emphasize entrepreneurship and economic empowerment as you would somewhat expect from the Pentecostal charismatic churches. And there's also, I mean, this relates to Weber's Protestant ethic in some ways, but also what is very crucial is a strong emphasis on education in this regard. And there I have another nice graph. We asked the church leaders what are the 5 most important SDGs. So just basically point out which ones are the 5 most important on a SDG chart, on an SDG overview. And you can see the high emphasis that is placed on quality education. I mean, this is really even before good health and well-being. So really, this illustrates, and this is very much connected with this notion of empowerment, of independent self-reliance, and so forth. Education is really seen as the key for that. 5, transformation. This relates to Eisenstadt's notion on the transformative potential, the capacity to change mindsets and in turn behavior. So African initiated churches, as we argue, are agents of social change and individual transformation. And one can illustrate, I mean, I put up 2 quotes to illustrate that. One from Bishop Lechanyane, one of the most important church leaders in South Africa, the leader of the largest church in Southern Africa, in fact. Be in a state of, this comes from an Easter sermon just before the municipal elections 2016 in South Africa. Be in a state of readiness. Prepare yourselves to go elect your local leaders who will represent your aspirations. I know that some of the candidates will be coming to you for the first and last time ever, even if they win. So you've got the power to determine who leads you, utilize that power to choose correctly and to empower your people. And I mean, that's just very much a strong notion there on how these churches or how this particular church encourages people to get involved in this to engage in social and political change. And another person, this relates more to the individual level, Pastor Daramola, leader of the Redeemed Christian Church of God in South Africa, regional overseer of that church in South Africa. You need to change the whole person, because it will be a waste of money, of time and money, if you train people without their lives being changed, and so forth. I won't read the whole thing. So this shows this individual aspect of transformation. Now the last one, and this is really where we identify the most substantial potential, is this idea of decolonizing development. Now, what does that mean? It's a nice keyword. We refer to two scholars, Aram Tsiai, who is a scholar of post-colonial studies at Kassel University, and Theresa Meyer, who's at Tübingen, to just give a perspective on what can be understood by de or post-colonial development. And Tsiai says notions of development other than the dominant ones, undergirded by Western hegemonic models of the organization of economy, politics, and knowledge. So different notions of development and dismantling of hierarchies between development experts and the people concerned. So very much this wider notion of empowerment. And Meyer develops 3 criteria in this regard: resistance and indigenization, with reference to different scholars, decentralization and empowerment, and dismantling of Eurocentric patterns of thought. And this very much relates back to those 3 core characteristics that we identified of this religious movement of African initiated Christianity: independence, contextuality, and spiritual worldview. So on this realm of independence, these African initiated Christianity, African initiated churches can foster development based on local agendas, agency, and ownership. And in that lies quite some potential for internal accountability and transparency. So this financial and institutional independence, not being outside funded. I mean, there are examples of churches with huge development programs, and when you wonder how is this financed, it's all internal finances. And of course, it also relates to priorities of the respective local communities, what sometimes is called development from below. Now, with regard to contextuality, the activities that these churches implement can be expected to be more aligned to contextual notions of development that are dominant in the local and relevant in the local context. And they are able to navigate in and make reference to social structures and local or contextual, cultural and religious worldviews and communities. And what is quite crucial, this is also something that that Swart points out in his contribution. They don't only act in comparison with NGOs. They don't only act as representatives of the local communities, but rather as focal point of people's action itself. I mean, they are in some ways the local communities.
Just another minute or so, Philip.
Excellent. I'll be done in 1 minute. Perfect. Okay. And this is the last, the second to last slide. So I guess 1.5 minutes. Spiritual worldview. This relates to this notion of dismantling Eurocentric patterns of thought and dominant Western secular notions of development. These churches bring forward an understanding of development that is related to contextual and spiritual worldviews, particularly where spiritual dimensions are part of development. And this is, again, a quote from Elijah Daramola: spiritual development is part of development. The good life includes spirituality. And another quote: the NGOs are taking care of people, but they do not take care of the spiritual part of the human being. So we are taking care of the people, but we go beyond. We also take the spirit, we also look at the spiritual well-being of the persons. And now this is the very last slide. When it comes to development, we have a spiritual development, we have physical and social development. So you cannot separate any of the developments from each other, because the church provides both the social and the spiritual development. And now the conclusion of this part, and with that of the whole presentation: in the field of tension between Western-dominated secular concepts of development and African in brackets spiritual worldviews, decolonizing concepts and practices of development, inter alia, means bringing forward alternative notions of development that adequately take into account local religious knowledge and cosmologies and incorporate cultural and spiritual dimensions. And this is something that really is a potential also to the global development discourse that African initiated Christianity can make. And with that, I'm ending. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was a very comprehensive introduction to the whole topic, very useful for everyone, I'm sure. So what I'll do now is we'll hand over to Ignatius, and if you can unmute now for 5 to 10 minutes of response. And likewise, Ignatius, I'll just let you know when you have a minute or two left. And
I'll stop sharing my screen then, yeah?
Sure. Okay, great. Okay. Over to you then.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to hear that I have between 5 and 10 and not 5. But I have here 2.5 pages that I'm going to read. So I'm going to do it in a sort of an old style way, reading what I've written down. So, and it's basically 3 points that I want to make. So the first point to start with is to say that I've not been able to read the whole book at this point in time. At the same time, however, I'm an author of one of the chapters in the book on the chapter on African initiated churches and development from below. I've also read the excellent introductory chapter by the editors. I really mean it. It's an excellent introduction. I also have closer experience of the evolution of this book, as I have been a participant in several workshops and conferences that emanated from the research project that Philipp has mentioned, Potentials of Cooperation with African Initiated Churches for Sustainable Development, of which the book is the product. As such, I have first-hand experience of a very impressive network that has been built up by Philipp Öhlmann and the other project leaders, a network consisting of African scholars, but perhaps even more importantly, church leaders from the African initiated churches across several African countries, as the book testifies. So let me conclude my first point with the following appreciation with some qualification. The book under discussion today gives testimony to an impressive network of African scholars and church leaders that have been established over a number of years by the editors. As such, the book makes a major contribution towards strengthening an authentic African voice in the international religion and development debate. That is a voice that is still very much underrepresented in the debate. And it also does so in a unique way by giving evidence of a new or different mode of doing religion and development by including the voices of leaders from the realm of African initiated churches. And just to quote them from the introductory text, I think is for me is meaningful. The editors write, the purely academic perspectives in the volume are complemented with essays by renowned church leaders themselves, marked as distinguished church leader contributions in the respective part of the book. These essays deliberately include personal views, experiences, and opinions, and provide forms of knowledge production that, by their very nature, pure research articles cannot provide. End of quote. What then is my qualification? As reflected by its editorship, the book is an initiative driven by researchers from the global north and made possible by resources from the global north. As such, the African representatives have become participants in a religion and development project, once again driven by representatives from the global north. However, without this drive, the book would not have happened. My second main point. I would also like to appreciate the book from the point of view of ongoing religious change in the African context. I've in my own scholarship become acutely aware of the importance of the Pentecostal and charismatic turn in the African religious landscape. The religious actors on which this book is focused undoubtedly constitutes a major religious and social force in sub-Saharan African society that needs to be taken seriously in theological and religious studies scholarship related to Africa, not least in the field of religion and development. From this vantage point, the book makes a major contribution towards strengthening this focus and addressing what the introductory text rightly observes remain an imbalance in the research to date, the attention given to mission-initiated Christianity in Africa at the cost of African-initiated Christianity. And just going to quote one sentence from the introductory text. The editors say, thus far there are only a limited number of studies investigating African independent and Pentecostal churches' contribution to development. From a personal point of view, then, I want to appreciate the way in which my participation in the Berlin-initiated network and the resultant contribution to the book has given me the opportunity to start addressing what has been a neglect in my own research to date. While I have been a scholar of religion and development in South African context for more than 2 decades, the chapter that I've written for the book marks perhaps my by African-initiated Christianity. As such, the undertaking reflected in my own chapter to scrutinize the way in which development from below has become an underlying concept or thesis in the literature on African-initiated churches has been an illuminating experience for me. In particular, it has led me to identify 5 dimensions defining the development from below thesis in the literature, which I argue towards the end could be used as a framework for ongoing research. To just mention the 5 dimensions: development from below as a desecularized catchphrase or idea, development from below as a counterpoint to development from above and concomitant state failure, development from below as a political dynamic, development from below as social change from below invigorated by radical personal transformation and the remaking of the Protestant ethic, and lastly, development from below as an acknowledged capacity to generate social capital. My last point then, because I think my time is also more or less up. and there's still much to say, I think. However, let me close by just mentioning the 3 elements from the introductory discussions I think could favorably be considered and discussed as the book's contribution on a conceptual and theoretical level. The first would be the editor's claim that the book, and by implication its authors, have overcome the instrumental or functional approach to religion and development. The second element, the broadened and inclusive definition of African-initiated churches. I think for some this is controversial. We have had quite debates on this. African-initiated churches are approached and defined in this book. And then lastly, the six themes that Philipp provides framework for considering the potential and actual contribution of African-initiated churches to sustainable development. I think this opens fruitful further debate and scope for research. So that's in a nutshell the little bit that I have.
Thank you ever so much, Ignatius. I particularly appreciated your reflection on how it's changed your own thought being involved in this project. I think that's important for us all. Okay, so what I'm going to do, and ending on those notes, you left kind of 3 questions or areas of interest for us to think about as well. But I'll throw it open to the group for any questions or reflections and anything that's linking to your own work as well. We're interested in all of that. You can, in the participant section in the chat, you can raise your hand, or you can type a question in the chat, or you can just unmute and let us know your question. So please, we're now opening to the group.
Can I ask you a question about the table that you had about the visions of the SDGs and the priorities? I was very puzzled to see that life underwater and climate change and was not seen really as a priority, which could be seen as quite worrying. But is it because they see that mainly as a problem of European, American, Chinese, for the Chinese or the Europeans to deal with, whether they are some sort of theological reflections from within these independent churches about the importance of creation, that we are part of nature, and in life, unless we care for the water in the same way as we care for our children, our future will be put at risk, especially if you contrast that with the vision of indigenous people from Latin America or from Oceania or even from India, where they see the connection with the land as part of themselves. And I remember talking to an anthropologist who's worked a lot in Africa. He was saying, well, because they have more of a pastoralist tradition, this connection to the land is different, the sense of belonging, kind of. While for the people in the Amazon, the ancestors really live on that land, and the river is sacred because my ancestors live there. But in Africa, you don't have that. So what are kind of the resources within African-initiated churches and theologies about how to deal with that? Because otherwise we're just reproducing the Western model that we are above nature, and nature is just for us to use, and that's it.
Thank you, Sabine. Philipp, yes, over to you.
Thank you very much for this question. This is also something that really somewhat that is very much noticeable, and that also puzzled us in a way, because it's something that is consistent even in the more rural areas. So it's not only an urban phenomenon. This data, but it's actually nearly everywhere. There's two answers or three answers that or thoughts that I have on this. I mean, it's not really answers; it's thoughts on this. The first one is I think there's a high dynamic in this in this whole question of ecology or this ecological dimension of sustainability with respect to African initiated Christianity. So I think it's a topic. I think if one did ask the same question now instead of 3 years ago or 4 years ago, the answers might already be somewhat different. Why am I saying that? We are jointly with University of Pretoria and Bread for the World, the German development NGO or FBO. We are in a consultative process with African initiated churches from Southern Africa and also other religious communities, and there seems to be quite a high dynamic to engage with this topic, but it seems to be somewhat a recent trend. Church leaders saying, I mean, this is not a comprehensive survey or anything, but church leaders saying, oh, we need to engage with this topic more. And for example, the Zion Christian Church that I mentioned, there you see a strong engagement having emerged over the past year or two. So I think within the global movement, Fridays for Future and so on, there might also be an increasing attention, because it really, the fact that climate change is changing the world can be felt everywhere. Yeah. So I think there's a dynamic there. First thought. The second thought is, and there I would like to refer back to Emmanuel Nim, a Ghanaian scholar, who wrote an article entitled "The Gods Are Dead, Now We Are in Charge," where he analyzes exactly this relationship of indigenous views where the river is sacred and so forth, and in relation to well, he does it in relation to Pentecostal theology, where all the indigenous spirituality is somehow done away with, and now the people themselves are in charge, and so this whole ecological care that came with it was somehow done away with in that process. And well, and Im argues there's a need for, as a Pentecostal theologian, he argues there's a need to re-engage with this spirituality. And well, and the third thought that I have is that it's superimposed, that ecological concerns are superimposed by the effects that this produces. I mean, that hunger is climate change produces hunger, but then what is the major problem? It's hunger, it's not climate change. So there's a little bit of a depending how you ask it.
It's also how the SDGs are stated in a way that, as we know that poverty is so complex, people are of course going to put poverty first and, see how the other things are linked together. It's hard to even answer that question, about the SDGs and how they're important. But okay, so we've got a question coming up from Katie, and then Bob will go second. So Katie, please.
Hi, yeah, well, this is really, really interesting and fun to kind of take a step back from the hustle and bustle of figuring out the new world order to reflect on an experience around the world. And I guess my question is coming from the perspective of what exactly we consider to be development. And I think, and it kind of relates to this discussion about climate change, but I think in your presentation, what most got my attention was that the African initiated churches seem to be giving an important reminder that the spiritual side of development is equally, if not more important than some of the material sides. But on the flip side, I noticed on that kind of list of types of assistance that are being provided that a lot of it was actually what we would consider charitable assistance or humanitarian assistance or material aid, as opposed to actual development intervention. And so I guess on one hand, I see the value of listening to that perspective, and I think that's a very, very important voice. But on the flip side, that perspective without the level of depth and analysis that we've had the luxury of spending decades and decades of developing in Western academia seems like it could also kind of be detrimental according to the principles of do no harm. So I guess how do we kind of take the best from both worlds, I guess, is where my question lands.
Philip, do you want to respond, or perhaps one of your co-contributors?
Well, I can very much agree with the question and relate to the question and agree with it. Perhaps just one minor point. I mean, to also somewhat explain this data. I didn't go into this, but I mean, it's a very heterogeneous and scattered movement. So you have lots of small religious communities, and for professionalized development engagement, also there's professionalized on a conceptual level and so forth, that requires a certain size, a certain whereas you have the larger those larger churches definitely do that and have that, and the data somewhat reflects many of these smaller churches engagements where their contribution is, if where there's like 100 people attending or so, their contribution is, well, we are providing a scholarship to a school student. So this is somewhat reflected there. This doesn't answer entirely your question, it's just an additional aspect there. But I very much relate to the question and agree with it. I mean, it's a question, how do you bridge this this gap there, and how do you take the best from two worlds, as you say? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If I can just quickly throw out, I think one of the things that in the research that I'm doing with World Vision, we're spending a lot of effort on right now is trying to figure out how do we actually systematize or measure or somehow take this concept of spiritual development and make it into something that we can integrate or teach others or kind of explain in a clear way. And it's very, very messy. But I think at the same time, it's increasingly, I'm starting to see why it's important to do that, because if not, then we end up with this existence that we have right now, which in some ways is fine, but in other ways is problematic, of parallel existences where we're just doing our thing and they're just doing their thing and never the twain shall meet.
I mean,
May I just, yeah.
Marie-Luise.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a very small comment on that. I think it is because you just mentioned this parallel world where the one are doing their Western secular thing and the others are doing their whatever spiritual thing. I think it is very interesting to see one of the quotes that we had was that it is a waste of time and money if you only give the training without the spiritual aspect. He's not saying you only need the spiritual aspect. He's saying you need both. And I think that is a little bit going in this way, it is also for those or for many of those African initiated churches, it is not to say, well, what you would describe as development relevant work is not interesting to us, but we would just say development relevant work is more than what you're doing, because it is also adding the spiritual side to it. And I think what is very interesting is to see what we also saw for the SDGs, that education got so many voices from all these church leaders. And I think that is, to me, that is a little bit where the way could go or should go, that in order to take the best of the two worlds.
Yeah, it has been pointed out that actually in our field of religion and development research, considering how many religious institutions run schools, it's an area that is relatively underdeveloped in our research. So I think that's noticeable, but of course the parallel structures is something that we come across all the time, and we're all trying to overcome in our various ways in our work, and coming up against barriers, but also seeing ways through as well. I'll hand over to Bob. Bob, if you can unmute, I can see you had your hand raised for a question.
Yeah, and thank you very much. You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, and thank you for the great job you've done in this research. I do recognize that the independent churches pretty much emanated as protest movements at the time of their formation, and seeking an independence and a contextual way in which they would do their things. But I'm interested in seeing how much you are able to note their transition from being a protest movement to being a partner movement with government in the work of development. Did you note that, or have they continued to remain as a protest movement, separate from government in the work of development? And if so, whichever way it has fallen, how much has that enabled their continued participation in development work, or how much has that hindered their continued participation in development work, either by being a partner of government or being apart from government?
Philipp, please, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very, very crucial question. I mean, I mean, there's not an easy answer here either, but there's in a way a dual perspective that I would open up. The one is that, of course, government is the crucial player. Governments nearly anywhere in the world are the crucial player in terms of development, and so there's in many instances definitely a cooperation also with government institutions. In South Africa, you have much of that, where government representatives are invited, for example, of the Department of Health, also are invited for workshops to the churches. So there is this kind of collaboration there on the one hand, so on a practical level. On the other hand, there's also quite a substantial skepticism towards government institutions, and that goes along, I mean, in the direction of corruption and being critical of corruption and so forth. So you can see both. I would say the field is much more differentiated now, and this really is a question that that one needs to look at in different contexts. I would say there's no general tendency there. I think you have both tendencies and are visible. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
So we've got a few questions coming through in the chat. I wonder, this might be open to Ignatius as well, next question about, I think this is from Steffi, although it says Rima, that in this, she works for an NGO in Malawi, and the pastor of this faith-based organization says that you shouldn't use the term development from below, because who are you to decide who is at the bottom? What does it even mean to be at the bottom? So to what extent do you think our own vocabulary locks us into these Western patterns of thinking without us even being aware of it very often? And how do you think we challenge that as a community? So that's a question about the development from below, and even writing about all the ways that African-initiated Christianity is different. Are we just reconfirming some of these categorizations and stereotypes? I think is an interesting question overall. Who would like to take that?
Perhaps I can just first say at the start that my approach to write that chapter was to, I mean, that is what the authors, I mean, that is the basic, I mean, sometimes the development from below is not always used as a concept, but it, I think it points to that meaning or to that idea of from below. I miss a bit of the question or the comment, but I see much positive in the idea of development from below, and I think how Philipp in the book, in his introduction, how he also relates that to the idea of decolonization. reflecting independence, self-reliance, etc. So whether we call it development or not, I mean, the idea of it for me is a positive dynamic.
Steffi, I wonder if you, I think it is Steffi, but I wonder if you would say a little bit more, because I'm interested by the idea that perhaps we, you know, the term is unhelpful when it's used by someone from outside, but then at the same time, the research is showing that the concept holds true. So it's more about how the term is used rather than perhaps the idea behind it. Would you like to say a little bit more, Steffi?
Yeah, I think, you know, that's exactly what I meant. I think the concept that it's trying to, that it's expressing is incredibly important and at the heart of long-term development. I was just making exactly the point that you said, that I know I catch myself all the time sort of writing things or thinking in ways or just using ways of expressing myself that are maybe don't actually match with what I'm trying to, yeah, with the concept I'm trying to get across. And I just wondered, yeah, whether not whether the concept is harmful, but whether our speakers thought that way of expressing it could lock us into patterns of thinking without even us being aware that, like, top down, bottom up, still thinking of there being a top and a bottom, and the bottom being the communities and the top being the international donors, and whether that was inherently a harmful way of thinking.
And this links us actually into Jonathan's question as well a little bit about how can global north donors and organisations, national governments, learn from these approaches to development without instrumentalising or co-opting these groups in the process, which is kind of the ultimate question. Like, we can bring forward this idea from research that spirituality is an essential part to development, but if you're not within that way of thinking or not familiar with that, there's a definite potential for that instrumentalization as well. Philipp, would you like to respond to this kind of cluster of questions?
I mean, I can only respond by saying this. I mean, it's just hugely important to question these concepts and their implications, and so I very much relate to this question. Is, I mean, who's to decide who's below and who's on top? And I think there are several of these concepts that we need to, I mean, I also, you know, people always speak of the marginalized, or the, you know, there's the marginalized or the poor, which is, I mean, the more multidimensional poverty measurements become, the more discriminating the term the poor is, yeah. So it's really, I think it's really crucial to question these the wording and the conceptual implications of what we have. And I think what we have tried to do, and I mean, this, I think there's a question to all of us, and we are only at the beginning there to get on a more equal level also in research. But what I think what we've been trying to do, and this relates to Jonathan's question also, how can we somehow create a level playing field there, or how can we, you know, have this kind of mutual engagement? What we've been trying to do is, first of all, to have as Nas pointed out, to have church leaders' voices as part of the this academic volume, so to have these to just have the unfiltered, and so to say, perspective, without unfiltered through researchers, no matter from where they are. And the second one, we many of these contributions are based on lectures that African initiated church leaders gave at our university in Berlin, where we also invited, you know, NGO representatives, government representatives, and so forth. So to somehow create a space where actually engagement is possible, that is not people from the global north going below to the grassroots, but, you know, to have this kind of open space of engagement. So I think that could be an important step forward.
Thanks. So we are at the top of the hour, but there's one last question. If we all have a minute, Severine, you have your hand up, so please go ahead.
Yeah, just a question of curiosity. What is the formation that the leaders of these churches have? Is there a kind of centralized formation scheme? Where do they conduct this reflection on theology and development? Or is there a formation, or is it, so how is that thinking about how they think about development from a faith perspective coming from? Yeah.
Yes, Philip, go ahead.
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly. You mean what influences their thinking on issues of religion and development? Is that the question, or do you mean in terms of their theology?
Yeah. Now, what influences their thinking? What do they get their training? Do they is there kind of set training for these leaders, or is it every church is free to interpret scriptures the way they want and have their own vision of
Yeah.
development?
Well, in basically yes. The second answer. There is some network structures. I mean, this all really depends. This is really very much heterogeneous, the situation there. But some do very much do their own thing in terms of their own scripture interpretation and developing their own theology. For especially the larger churches like the Zion Christian Church in South Africa, there you see very much their own perspective. You have others where there are networks, and also in terms of the formation, where there are joint training institutions. You see that a lot in Pentecostal in Pentecostal churches, and also the organization of African instituted churches plays a very important role in that. The umbrella organization organizing theological formation formats from a distance. And what you'll see, what is quite a common perspective, is that there's somehow an allocation to other churches. So smaller churches somehow lean towards larger churches, and so there's this kind of informal training that someone who is an old experienced church leader passes on their knowledge to other church leaders. And in some cases, it's very much formalized. You have institutions and so forth, and professionalized training and so forth. In other instances, it's really very much informal and oral and not formalized. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're past the end of our time. I'm sure we all have other Zoom meetings to go to. So thank you so much, Philip. Thank you so much, Ignatius, and Marie-Luise as well as co-contributor to the volume. I think that we've had a great discussion as well. I'd like to just remind people, I put the link on the chat if you're interested in speaking or responding. There are a few, they're only November and December, it's open for speaking, but there's more spots open for responding as well. Our next session is the 11th of June at the same time. We'll hear from Andrea Stanker from the Center for Humanitarian Action, and she's going to be presenting about faith-based organizations in post-earthquake Haiti, the full range of faith-based organizations involved. It's a very interesting piece of research. So I hope that you'll join then. And then final thing to say is just a huge thank you again to everyone for participating. We still have the sign up available, so spread to your networks if you think anyone else might be interested in joining us. And thanks once again to the speakers. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks everyone, bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Nas, also for your response.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.